My tea had gone cold, a detail that seemed trivial but felt like a perfect, bitter metaphor. I was sitting in the cushioned armchair of my new apartment, a place I had chosen for its view of the city lights and its profound, unbreachable quiet. The silence was a balm, a stark contrast to the cavernous, echoing halls of the life I had left behind. That silence was earned, paid for with a currency of tears and betrayal that had left my heart feeling like a vault emptied by thieves in the night. It was a peaceful silence, but it was born from a storm so violent it had reshaped the entire landscape of my life, tearing down a structure I had spent 50 years building. I always thought I knew my son, Mark. I had held him when he was a squalling infant, his tiny fingers curled around mine with a strength that belied his size. I had nursed his fevers, celebrated his small victories, and absorbed his adolescent angers like a patient, loving sponge. I thought the core of that boy, the essence of him, was something I understood as well as I understood the grain of the oak floors in the home my late husband, Richard, and I had built. But I was wrong. The man he had become was a stranger to me, a hollowed-out version of my child, his features rearranged by greed and weakness into a mask I could no longer recognize. The thought was prompted by a phone call just an hour earlier. Lily's bright, cheerful voice, a tiny sunbeam cutting through my quiet afternoon. "Grandma, are we still going to the botanical gardens on Saturday? You promised to show me the carnivorous plants." Her excitement was a physical thing, a warmth that traveled through the phone line and settled in my chest. I had smiled, my first genuine smile of the day. "Of course, my sweet girl. I have the tickets right here on my desk. I'll pick you up at 10-inch then," another voice, sharp and cold, like ice chipping. "Jessica." "Lily, what did I say about bothering your grandmother?" She's a very busy woman. The lie was so blatant, so saccharine sweet in its venom, that it almost made me laugh. I was anything but busy. I had all the time in the world, time I desperately wanted to spend with my only grandchild. The line had been filled with a brief, muffled shuffling, and then Jessica's voice returned, devoid of the false sweetness she used for Lily. "Helen, we'll have to cancel. We are taking Lily to a brand-building workshop for children. It's very exclusive, a brand-building workshop. For an 8-year-old. The absurdity, the sheer cold-blooded ambition of it, was breathtaking. "Jessica," I had said, my voice dangerously calm, "let me speak to Lily so I can tell her goodbye." A pause. "She's already run off to her room. She was disappointed, of course, but she'll get over it. It's for her own good. We have to think of her future." The line went dead, and with it, the small warmth Lily's call had brought. It was this casual cruelty, this constant, strategic severing of the one pure bond one had left, that had forced me to sit here and retrace the path from there to here. I needed to lay it all out in my mind, a long and sorry road, to remind myself that my choices, however drastic, were not made in haste. They were the cumulative result of 1,000 cuts, a slow and deliberate bleeding of my love, my money, and my dignity. I needed to remember the weight of the promise I made to Richard, and how the very people I was meant to protect had forced me to break it in order to survive. The story wasn't a simple one of a family squabble, it was an epic of erosion, the slow, grinding down of a mountain until all that was left was dust and bedrock. And I was the bedrock. They had discovered, to their profound shock, that I was not as soft and yielding as they had believed. I was stone, and I was done being worn away. My life with Richard had been a testament to shared dreams and mutual effort. We hadn't been born into wealth, we had forged it ourselves, with calloused hands and minds that never stopped working. Richard was a builder, a man who could see a cathedral in a pile of bricks, and I was a bookkeeper, a woman who could see the future in a column of numbers. Together, we were an unstoppable force. We started with a small loan and a single pickup truck, Richard leading a small crew by day while I managed the payroll, invoices, and budgets by night at our small kitchen table. He was the heart of the business, full of vision and an unshakable belief in his own abilities. I was its nervous system, meticulously tracking every dollar, ensuring our foundations were as strong financially as the ones he poured from concrete. We built our company, R&H Construction, brick by brick, contract by contract. The days were long, the risks were high, but the satisfaction was immeasurable. We weren't just building houses for other people, we were building our future. And at the heart of that future was the dream of our own home. Not just a house, but an estate. A legacy. We bought a sprawling 10-acre plot of land when Mark was just a boy. A beautiful piece of earth with rolling hills and a stand of ancient oak trees. For years, it was just a dream we visited on weekends, walking the property and imagining where each room would go. Richard would pace out the dimensions of the great room, his arms outstretched, a wide grin on his face. Big enough for grandkids to run wild, Helen, he'd say. Big enough for the whole family at Christmas. I would stand by the largest oak, my ledger of dreams open in my mind, calculating the cost of the foundation, the roof, the windows that would let in the morning sun. We didn't rush it. We saved, we planned, and we designed every inch of it ourselves. When the time was right, Richard's own company, his own trusted crew, broke ground. He was on site every day, not as the boss, but as one of the craftsmen. He laid the stonework for the grand fireplace himself, his hands, which could be so gentle with me, proving just as skilled with a trowel and mortar. I chose every finish, every faucet, every tile, my choices guided not by fleeting trends, but by a desire for timelessness and endurance. That house was a living thing, infused with our love and labor. It was where we raised Mark, where his height chart was marked on a doorframe, where the scuffs on the floorboards told stories of tricycle races and wrestling matches. It was more than wood and stone, it was the physical manifestation of our partnership. When Richard got sick, the house became our sanctuary. The progression of his illness was slow, a cruel thief that stole his strength, but never his spirit. We spent his final years in the sunroom he had designed, looking out over the gardens I tended. He would hold my hand, his grip weaker but still warm, and we would talk about the future. It was during one of those quiet afternoons, with the scent of roses drifting in through the open window, that he made me promise. Helen, he'd whispered, his voice raspy. Take care of the boy. He's a good man, but he's soft. Not like us. Don't let him make foolish choices. I had squeezed his hand, my throat tight. I will, Richard. I always will. He took a shallow breath. And the house, keep it in the family. Let it be a gathering place. Don't ever let it be broken up. It's our story, written in stone, I promised. With tears streaming down my face, I promised I would protect our son, and I would protect our home. I believed it was the most sacred vow I would ever make. In the years after Richard's death, the house became my companion. Its familiar creaks and groans were a comfort. I managed our finances, the portfolio we had built so carefully, with the same diligence I always had. I was comfortable, secure, and self-sufficient. I lived simply, finding joy in my garden, my books, and the regular visits from Mark. The promise I made to Richard was the guiding principle of my life. It was a wait, yes, but a welcome one, a final connection to the man I loved. I had no idea then that this sacred promise would one day be twisted into a cage, its bars forged from the very love I sought to protect. Mark met Jessica at a charity gala, an event I had encouraged him to attend and for which I had, of course, bought the ticket. When he told me about her, his voice was alight with an enthusiasm I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. She's incredible, Mom. Smart, beautiful, she works in marketing. She's so ambitious. I was happy for him, truly. My son had been adrift since his father's passing, coasting through a mid-level management job with little passion. Perhaps this woman would be the spark he needed. I invited them for dinner. The moment Jessica walked through the front door of the estate, a subtle alarm bell rang in the back of my mind. It was nothing I could articulate, just a faint dissonance. She was undeniably beautiful, polished and poised, her smile perfectly calibrated. But her eyes didn't smile. They scanned. They moved over the high ceilings, the handcrafted mahogany banister, the oil painting of Richard that hung in the foyer. It was the quick, assessing glance of an auctioneer, not a guest. "Oh, Mark, your mother's home is magnificent," she said, her voice a silky purr. "So much history here. So much potential." The word potential hung in the air, and for a moment, I felt a chill. Throughout dinner, her questions were all about the business, the estate, its value. She wrapped them in the language of polite interest, but the underlying curiosity was rapacious. "It must be so much work for you to manage all this on your own, Helen," she'd say, a look of faux concern on her face. "Have you ever considered hiring a professional firm to manage your assets?" I just smiled politely. "Richard and I built our assets from scratch, Jessica. I'm quite comfortable managing them myself." I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, annoyance, perhaps, before it was replaced by that perfect, placid smile. Mark, of course, saw none of it. He was besotted, hanging on her every word, beaming with pride as she charmed her way through the evening. When I tried to gently voice my reservations to him a few days later, he became defensive. "Mom, you're being unfair. You don't even know her. She's just interested in our family. Can't you be happy for me?" I saw then that any criticism of Jessica would be perceived as a criticism of him, an attack on his judgment. So, I did what so many mothers do. I bit my tongue and hoped for the best. I hoped my instincts were wrong, that this was just my own overprotective nature rearing its head. Their engagement was announced 6 months later. Jessica's vision for the wedding was something out of a magazine, a spectacle of excess that had very little to do with love and everything to do with performance. The venue she chose was a historic hotel ballroom, the flower arrangements were flown in from Holland, and her dress cost more than my first car. When Mark came to me, his face a mixture of excitement and anxiety, to discuss the budget, I knew what was coming. "Mom, we want it to be perfect." A day to remember. I looked at the preliminary budget he held, the numbers swimming before my eyes. It was a fortune. "Mark," I said gently, "this is a lot. Your father and I had a simple wedding in the garden here. It was beautiful because our friends and family were with us." He shifted uncomfortably. "I know, Mom, but times have changed. Jessica has standards. It's important for her career, for the people she knows, to make a good impression." The argument was nonsensical, but I could see it was not his own. It was a line fed to him by Jessica. Still, the echo of Richard's voice, "Take care of the boy," resonated in my mind. I saw this as my duty. I told myself it was an investment in his happiness, a foundation for his new life. I agreed to pay for the majority of it. I wrote the check, a sum that made my hand tremble slightly, and handed it over. Jessica accepted my contribution not with gratitude, but with the air of someone receiving a payment that was long overdue. That was the first major withdrawal from the bank of my goodwill, the first time I felt the bitter taste of being treated not as a mother, but as a resource. It was a taste I would become all too familiar with. After the honeymoon in the Maldives, which I later discovered was also financed by a credit card I was quietly paying off, Mark approached me with a proposition that was classic Jessica, cloaked in the guise of filial concern. "Mom, Jessica and I have been talking," he began, his tone earnest. "This house is so big for you, all alone. We worry about you. We were thinking, what if we moved in? We could live in the West Wing. We could help you with the upkeep, and you wouldn't be so lonely." I knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in my stomach, that this was not about my loneliness. It was about their convenience and their ambition. The estate was a status symbol they couldn't afford on their own, and moving in was the most direct path to possessing it. Yet, The other part of Richard's promise echoed in my ears: keep it in the family. Let it be a gathering place. Was this not what he meant? Having my son and his new wife under the same roof. It was a perversion of the dream, I sensed, but on the surface, it fit the description. I convinced myself it was the right thing to do, that their presence would liven up the quiet halls, that perhaps having them close would allow me to steer Mark back toward the sensible, grounded man I knew he could be. I agreed. Their moving in marked the beginning of the slow bleed, a steady, relentless siphoning of my resources. It started small. Jessica would redecorate their wing, presenting me with invoices for designer furniture and silk curtains that cost a small fortune. It's about making it our own, Helen, she'd say with a dazzling smile. And it adds to the house's value. Really? Then came the car. Mark's perfectly reliable sedan was suddenly not good enough. Jessica says it doesn't project the right image for my career, he explained, avoiding my gaze. I need something more professional. The something more professional turned out to be a brand new German luxury SUV. I protested, pointing out the absurdity of the expense. Mark's response was a new and ugly tactic: emotional blackmail. I thought you wanted to support me, Mom. Dad always supported me. The invocation of his father was a knife twisted in my gut. I relented, transferring the money, and felt a piece of my respect for my son chip away. My ledger, the same type of book I had used for I&H construction for decades, became my secret confidant. In its neat columns, I recorded every penny. $35,000 Mark's new car, justification. Career image $15,000 Jessica's wardrobe update, justification. Networking events $25,000 luxury vacation to Aspen, justification. Needed to distress from wedding planning. I documented it all, not because I ever intended to ask for it back, but because I needed a tangible record. I needed proof that I wasn't imagining the scale of their entitlement. The numbers on the page were a stark, undeniable confirmation of the truth. They were spending my retirement. The funds Richard and I had so carefully invested, the safety net we had built for my old age, were being drained to finance a lifestyle of pure fantasy. Jessica quit her job in marketing to become a full-time, lifestyle influencer, a pursuit that seemed to involve little more than photographing expensive handbags in various rooms of my house and producing no income whatsoever. In fact, it only created more expenses. I need a new camera, Helen. For the brand, the lighting in the library is terrible for video content. We need to hire a consultant. Each request was presented as a critical business expense, a vital step on her path to imagined stardom. I started selling off stocks, small blocks at first, then larger ones. Each sale felt like a betrayal of Richard, of our hard work. But the choice was always presented as one between my financial security and my son's happiness. And every time, trapped by my promise, I chose him. I found myself becoming a ghost in my own home. They would host lavish dinner parties for their new, wealthy friends, and I would be politely encouraged to have a tray in my room. It's just that it's mostly shop talk, Helen. You'd be bored, Jessica would explain, her voice dripping with condescension. I was no longer the matriarch of the estate. I was the live-in financier, the silent partner, whose only role was to sign the checks. The slow bleed was more than just financial, it was emotional, a draining of my spirit, leaving me anemic and weary in the heart of the legacy I was supposed to protect. The birth of my granddaughter, Lily, was a sunburst in a sky that had become perpetually overcast. When Mark placed her in my arms for the first time, a tiny, perfect bundle wrapped in pink, all the resentment and anxiety I'd been harboring seemed to melt away. Here she was, the third generation. This was what the house was for. This was the future Richard had envisioned, running through these halls. In that moment, I would have given them anything. And for a while, they didn't have to ask. I poured all the love that had been dammed up inside me into that little girl. I bought her clothes, toys, and books. I set up a college fund for her, a separate account that I fiercely protected, the one financial fortress they would not be allowed to breach. As Lily grew from an infant into a curious toddler, and then a bright little girl, she became my reason for enduring the daily humiliations. She and I formed a secret alliance, a bond of genuine affection that stood in stark contrast to the transactional nature of every other relationship in that house. She didn't care about designer furniture or luxury cars. She cared about the stories I told her about her grandfather. She loved the secret corners of the garden where the best wildflowers grew. Her favorite place in the entire, cavernous house was my small sewing room, a space Jessica had dismissed as cluttered and dated. Lily would sit for hours on a stool beside me, her eyes wide with fascination, as I showed her how to thread a needle or mend a tear. She loved the smell of old fabric and cedar, the comforting hum of the sewing machine. Our bond, however, became another tool for Jessica to wield. Lily was no longer just a child, she was leverage. "Helen, we really need a new, top-of-the-line SUV," Jessica announced one afternoon. "The one you bought, Mark, is 2 years old already. The safety ratings aren't the best. It's for Lily's sake, you understand." Every exorbitant demand was now prefaced with "for Lily's sake." The renovations to the nursery were a prime example. It was not enough to paint the walls and buy a new crib. Jessica hired an interior designer from the city who specialized in holistic child development spaces. The result was a room that cost over $50,000, complete with an air purification system imported from Sweden, and a hand-painted mural of endangered species. It looked like a museum exhibit, cold and sterile, a room designed to be photographed for social media, not for a child to actually play in. As Lily got older, Jessica's campaign to undermine our relationship became more insidious and deliberate. If I gave Lily a cookie I had baked, Jessica would swoop in and replace it with an organic, gluten-free, sugar-free alternative, tutting about my old-fashioned ideas on nutrition. If I started to tell Lily a fairy tale, Jessica would interrupt with, "Let's read something more empowering, sweetie. That princess narrative is so problematic." Our time together was increasingly monitored and curtailed. Spontaneous afternoons in the garden were replaced by a rigid schedule of violin lessons, Mandarin tutoring, and play-based coding classes. Jessica was curating her daughter's childhood like she was curating her Instagram feed, and there was no room in her brand for a simple, loving grandmother. I endured it all for those stolen moments with Lily. A quick hug in the hallway, a whispered secret, a shared smile over the top of Jessica's head. Lily was perceptive. She knew. Sometimes she would sneak into my room after Jessica thought she was asleep. "I like your stories best, Grandma," she'd whisper, curling up beside me on the bed. "Can you tell me one about Grandpa Richard again?" In those moments, I would feel a surge of fierce, protective love that gave me the strength to carry on. I was staying for her. I was tolerating the slow decay of my finances and my spirit because I couldn't bear the thought of leaving Lily alone in that cold, ambitious house with two parents who saw her not as a daughter, but as a project. The hope she represented was the only thing keeping me there, a single, flickering candle in a house full of gathering shadows. The announcement came on a Tuesday morning over breakfast I had made and which Jessica was pushing around her plate with a fork. "Mark and I have made a decision," she declared, not looking at me but at her phone. "We are going to do a full renovation of the main living areas. It's time to bring this house into the 21st century." Mark, sitting opposite her, shifted in his chair and took a large gulp of coffee, a sure sign of his discomfort. "We've already met with an architect," Jessica continued, swiping through images on her screen. "He has some brilliant ideas. Open concept living, minimalist aesthetic, floor-to-ceiling glass. We'll have to gut most of the ground floor." I felt the blood drain from my face. Gut the ground floor. That meant the great room with the fireplace Richard had built. The library with its custom-milled cherry wood shelves. The very heart of our home. Jessica, that's not a renovation. That's a demolition, I said, my voice trembling slightly. She finally looked up from her phone, her expression one of mild irritation, as if I were a slow child who couldn't grasp a simple concept. It's a reimagining, Helen. The current layout is so dated. It's dark. It doesn't flow. This will maximize the property's value. Mark cleared his throat. The architect said it could increase the resale value by as much as 40%, Mom. It's a smart investment. The word investment was their shield, the justification for every selfish desire. They weren't preserving a legacy, they were calculating the future profits from its destruction. For the first time, I didn't just bite my tongue. I put my foot down. No, I said, my voice quiet but firm. The answer is no. We cannot afford it. And more importantly, this house is a memorial to your father. I will not allow you to tear it apart. Jessica's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose. Excuse me. You cannot afford it. Helen, this estate is a gold mine. You're just sitting on its potential. The ensuing argument was the worst we'd ever had. Jessica's voice grew shrill, her mask of politeness slipping to reveal the raw greed beneath. Mark, caught in the middle, chose his side. He sided with his wife. Mom, you're being sentimental and irrational, he shouted, his face red. This is about our future. It's what Dad would have wanted, for the house to be the best it can be. The lie was so profound, so disrespectful to his father's memory, that it left me speechless. I retreated to my room, my hands shaking, the sound of their angry, frustrated voices echoing down the hall. A few days later, seeking clarity, I arranged to have lunch with Arthur Vance. Arthur had been Richard's best friend since childhood and his partner in the early, lean years of the business. He was a widower himself, a man as practical and sharp as a tack, with an accountant's mind and a deeply ingrained sense of loyalty. He was the only person left who truly understood the world Richard and I had built together. We met at a quiet diner, the kind of place Richard and I used to frequent. Over coffee, I confessed everything. I didn't spare myself, detailing my own weakness in allowing things to get so out of hand. Then, I slid my ledger across the table. Arthur put on his reading glasses and opened it. He was silent for a long time, his only movement the slow, deliberate turning of the pages. His brow furrowed, and a muscle twitched in his jaw. When he finally looked up, his expression was one of profound, cold anger. Helen, he said, his voice low and serious. Do you know what this is? This isn't a family supporting each other. This is elder abuse. It's financial exploitation, plain and simple. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. I had thought of it as weakness, as misguided love, but I had never dared to label it so bluntly. They are bankrupting you, he continued, tapping a finger on the final, staggering total at the bottom of the page. They have spent nearly every liquid asset you and Richard worked your entire lives to accumulate. For what? 4 handbags and parties and a German car. He leaned forward, his eyes boring into mine. Richard didn't make you that promise so you could be a servant in your own home. He made it because he trusted you to be the guardian of his legacy. And right now, these two are taking a sledgehammer to it. He would never, ever have stood for this. He would be furious, not at you, but for you. Arthur's words were a bucket of ice water, shocking me out of the fog of guilt and obligation I had been living in. He validated the resentment that had been festering in my gut. He gave me permission to be angry. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker not of weary resignation, but of fight. I was the guardian of the legacy, and the greatest threat to it wasn't a fluctuating market, or a bad investment, it was living right under my roof. The final, irrevocable break came, as these things often do, over a matter of pure vanity. Jessica decided she needed to host a grand summer gala, an event designed to cement her status among the local elite. The renovations were far from complete. In fact, They were stalled due to my refusal to release more funds, but one wing of the house had been transformed into a stark, white, soulless space that she deemed acceptable for entertaining. She and Mark came to me in the library, the one room they hadn't yet touched, and presented me with a budget for the party. It included 5-star caterers, a string quartet, valet parking, and a lighting designer. The total cost was just shy of $50,000. I looked at the paper and felt nothing. The shock, the anger, the hurt, it was all gone, burned out. All that remained was a cold, quiet emptiness. No, I said, sliding the budget back across the polished mahogany table. Jessica's face tightened. What do you mean, no? I mean I will not be paying for this party, I stated, my voice even. There is no more money for parties, what are you talking about? There's no more money. Mark interjected, his voice rising in panic. Of course there is. The portfolio, the portfolio has been systematically drained to fund your lifestyle, I said, looking directly at my son. And the house is not a bank account. Jessica let out a short, sharp, ugly laugh. This is ridiculous. You're trying to humiliate us. After everything we've done to try and modernize this place, to build a life here. They argued, they pleaded, they threatened. They accused me of being selfish, of being jealous of their happiness, of trying to ruin their lives. It was all just noise. I was impervious to it now. I had heard it all before. Finally, exhausted and furious, they stormed out. Later that evening, a wave of what I can only describe as foolish pity washed over me. Perhaps I was being too harsh. Mark was still my son. So I did one last, foolish thing. I went to my desk, transferred $10,000 into Mark's account, and sent him a simple text message, "This is a gift. It is the last one. Do not ask me for anything again." I thought it was a compromise, a final, inadequate olive branch. I was wrong. It was simply the final payment for my own execution. The day of the gala arrived, a sweltering Saturday in August. The sounds of preparation, trucks arriving, staff shouting instructions, the faint strains of a violin being tuned, filled the air. The thought of being in the house during the event, a ghost at a feast I had paid for, was unbearable. I needed to escape. I put on my walking shoes, grabbed a water bottle, and left through the garden gate, planning to spend a few hours at the nearby nature preserve. When I returned that evening, as dusk was settling, the estate was transformed. Fairy lights twinkled in the trees, music drifted on the warm air, and the driveway was lined with expensive cars. I walked up the long, familiar path toward the front door, my key in my hand. As I approached, I could see figures moving behind the large windows, silhouettes of strangers laughing and drinking in my home. I inserted my key into the lock. It didn't turn. I tried again, jiggling it, thinking it had simply stuck. But it was no use. The lock was solid, unyielding. My blood ran cold. I stepped back and looked at the gleaming new hardware on the door, a modern, digital keypad system. They had changed the locks. They had changed the locks on my own home without telling me. My key, the key Richard had placed in my hand the day we moved in, was useless. I stood there on the stone steps, frozen. The sounds of the party, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, seemed to be mocking me. I was an exile, standing at the gates of my own kingdom. I pulled out my phone and called Mark. It rang and rang, then went to voicemail, the sound of the party loud in the background. I tried again. Voicemail. I sent a text, "I am outside. The key doesn't work. I am locked out." No reply. I could see him through the window then, standing with a group of people, a champagne flute in his hand, laughing at something someone had said. My son. My only child. He was hosting a party, paid for with my money, in my house, from which he and his wife had locked me out. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot, searing wave that washed over me, so intense it made me feel dizzy. I was not a mother. I was not the matriarch. I was a problem that had been conveniently and temporarily disposed of so as not to spoil the party. In that moment, standing in the dark, listening to the sounds of their celebration, the promise I had made to Richard finally shattered. It hadn't just been broken, it had been desecrated. And the love I held for my son died with it, not in a burst of flame, but in a final, cold extinguishment. I didn't knock. I didn't shout. I simply turned around and walked away. The long gravel driveway crunched under my sensible walking shoes, each step taking me further from the life I had known and closer to a future I couldn't yet imagine. I walked until the music faded and the twinkling lights were just a distant glimmer, and then I called a taxi. That night, I stayed in a clean, anonymous, blessedly quiet hotel room on the other side of town. I sat on the edge of the stiff, unfamiliar bed, and did not cry. The capacity for tears had been burned out of me, cauterized by the white-hot humiliation of being locked out of my own home. What was left was something else entirely. It was a cold, hard clarity, the kind that comes after a high fever breaks. The woman who had walked down that driveway was not the same one who had checked into the hotel. The promise keeper, the endlessly forgiving mother, the soft-hearted widow, she was gone. In her place was Helen, the co-founder of I&H Construction. Helen, the woman who had stared down bankers and negotiated with tough union leaders. Helen, the bookkeeper, who knew that when a partnership became toxic and liabilities exceeded assets, the only sensible move was to liquidate. The love was gone, the obligation was void, and all that remained was a business transaction gone sour. The grief for the son I had lost gave way to a crystalline, cold resolve. I had spent years trying to protect him from his own weakness, and in doing so, I had nearly destroyed myself. No more. The promise to Richard, I now understood, was not about a physical building. It was about protecting the fruits of our life's work. By allowing Mark and Jessica to squander it, I had been failing in my duty, not fulfilling it. The truest way to honor Richard's legacy was to save it from them. The next morning, I did not call my son. I called Arthur. My voice, when I spoke, was as steady and calm as I had ever heard it. Arthur, it's Helen, I said. It's time. I want you to call the developers we spoke about last year. The ones who were interested in the land. The estate is for sale. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Helen, Arthur said, his voice gentle but laced with grim satisfaction. I'm so sorry it came to this. But I am also so relieved to hear you say it. I'll make the call right now. My next call was to a lawyer, the most formidable corporate litigator Arthur had recommended months ago, just in case. I explained the situation with the same dispassionate clarity. I was the sole owner of the property. Richard, in his infinite wisdom, had ensured the deed was structured that way, to protect me. I wanted to list it immediately. I wanted to draft eviction notices. And I wanted to explore my options regarding the vast sums of money loaned over the years. I spent the rest of an incredibly productive day in my hotel room with my ledger, a calculator, and a fresh legal pad. I worked with the methodical precision I had once used to budget for a new subdivision. I calculated the total, down to the last penny, of everything they had taken. The cars, the vacations, the wardrobe updates, the failed influencing career, the wedding. The final sum was astronomical, a testament to both their breathtaking greed and my profound foolishness. But I felt no shame. I felt only a grim sense of purpose. I was no longer a victim. I was the CEO of my own life, staging a hostile takeover to oust a corrupt and incompetent management team. My emotions had been burned away, leaving only the clean, hard lines of a balance sheet. And the balance sheet told me it was time to sell. The large, commercial-grade, for sale by private treaty sign was hammered into the pristine front lawn of the estate on a Wednesday morning. I had specifically instructed the real estate agent, a discreet professional recommended by Arthur, to ensure it was placed in the most visible location possible. I imagined the moment Jessica would see it, perhaps on her way out to a pointless luncheon or a shopping trip. The thought gave me a sliver of cold satisfaction. It took less than an hour for my phone to ring. It was Mark. His voice was a frantic, panicked squawk, stripped of its usual smooth condescension. "Mom? What is this? What have you done? There's a for sale sign on the lawn. It has to be a mistake." I let him finish, his voice cracking with disbelief and rage. When he paused to take a breath, I spoke. My tone was not that of a mother, but of a creditor calling in a debt. "It's no mistake, Mark," I said calmly. "I'm selling the house, you can't. This is our home. This is Lily's home. What about Dad's promise?" "Your father's promise was about protecting a legacy, not financing a fantasy," I replied, my voice like ice. "You and Jessica have treated this family and this home as your personal expense account. You defaulted on the terms of our arrangement when you locked me out of my own house. So, I am exercising my right as the sole owner to liquidate the asset." There was a stunned silence, followed by sputtering. "This is insane. You've lost your mind. Jessica is, she's beside herself." "That is no longer my concern," I said. "You and your wife will receive a formal notice to vacate the premises within 30 days, as per the law. I suggest you start looking for a new place to live." I hung up before he could respond. 2 days later, they appeared at the door of my temporary residence, a serviced apartment I had rented. They must have gotten the address from the lawyer. Mark looked pale and defeated, but Jessica was a storm front of condensed fury. She began shouting before I had even fully opened the door. "How dare you!" she shrieked, her face contorted with a rage that made her beautiful features look ugly and sharp. "You are trying to destroy our lives. You are a selfish, bitter old woman." I simply stood aside and gestured for them to enter. "Lower your voice, Jessica. We are not going to have a screaming match." I led them to the small sitting area and gestured for them to sit. I remained standing. I had placed my ledger on the coffee table. I picked it up. "Before you continue with your accusations," I said, my voice cutting through her tirade, "I want you to look at this." I opened it and placed it in front of them. "This is a detailed accounting of every dollar you have taken from me since your wedding. The car you're driving, Mark. The jewelry you're wearing, Jessica. Your vacations. Your failed business ventures. The party you threw after locking me out. It's all in here." They stared at the pages, at the neat columns of dates, descriptions, and figures. Mark's face went from pale to ashen. Jessica scanned it with a look of pure contempt, as if the numbers themselves were a personal insult. "The sale of the house," I continued, my voice unwavering, "will, I hope, be sufficient to replenish the retirement fund that you have spent. It will allow me to live out my remaining years without the fear of poverty that you were so callously inflicting upon me. A significant portion of the remainder will be placed into an ironclad trust for Lily's education and future. A trust that you will have absolutely no access to." At that moment, the doorbell rang. I had timed it perfectly. "That will be Mr. Harrison," I said. "He's the primary developer interested in the property. I'm accompanying him for a final site inspection." I opened the door to a tall, professional-looking man in a sharp suit. It was Arthur's contact. "Mr. Harrison, thank you for coming. My son, Mark, and his wife, Jessica. They are the current occupants." I introduced them with frosty formality. Jessica looked from the developer's expensive suit and briefcase to my calm face, and in that instant, the reality of her situation crashed down upon her. This wasn't a threat. It wasn't a negotiating tactic. It was over. Her face, which had been a mask of fury, crumpled. Her carefully constructed world of status, her dreams of being the grand lady of the estate, of hosting galas and impressing her shallow friends, it was all turning to dust before her very eyes. She didn't cry with remorse or sadness. She broke down with the guttural, raw-throated sob of a thwarted thief who had been caught red-handed just before making off with the crown jewels. She sank onto the sofa, her body shaking with pathetic, impotent rage. Mark just stood there, a hollow man, watching the life he had chosen disintegrate. I looked at the ruin of them both, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt a profound, liberating peace. The sale of the estate went through with remarkable speed. Mr. Harrison's development firm made an offer that was, frankly, astonishing. The land, it turned out, was even more valuable than Arthur had estimated, situated perfectly for a community of luxury homes. The closing was a simple, sterile affair in a lawyer's office. I signed the papers, my hand steady, and with the stroke of a pen, 50 years of my life were converted into a figure on a bank statement. But it was so much more than that. It was the moment I bought my freedom. True to my word, the first thing I did was sit down with a team of financial planners and attorneys to establish the Lily Richarda Legacy Trust. I named it for my granddaughter and her grandfather, linking the future to the past. The terms were unbreakable. The funds were designated for her education, her health, and to provide her with a substantial nest egg when she turned 25. The trustees were myself, Arthur, and a stern-faced female banker, who looked as if she ate nails for breakfast. Mark and Jessica were explicitly barred from ever having signatory authority or influence over the funds. My next act was to secure my own future. I purchased a beautiful, light-filled apartment in a modern building with a concierge and excellent security. It wasn't enormous, but it was perfect. It had 2 bedrooms, one for me, one for Lily's visits, and a wide balcony that overlooked the sprawling city. I furnished it not with the heavy, history-laden pieces from the old house, but with new things that I chose just for myself: a comfortable sofa, a good reading lamp, and a state-of-the-art sound system on which to play my classical music. As for Mark and Jessica, they faded from my life like a bad dream. I heard through the grapevine that they had rented a small townhouse in a sterile suburb far from their old, glamorous haunts. Mark was forced to sell his luxury SUV, and Jessica's influencer career evaporated without the backdrop of the grand estate to prop it up. They had to live within their own means for the first time, a punishment more fitting than any I could have devised. My relationship with Lily, however, blossomed. With her parents' toxic influence removed, our visits became joyful and relaxed. I arranged them through my lawyer, a formal process that prevented any direct, unpleasant contact with Mark or Jessica. I would pick her up, and we would spend our Saturdays at museums, parks, and, yes, the botanical gardens, where I finally showed her the fascinating, carnivorous plants. We baked cookies in my new kitchen, and she didn't have to worry about them being snatched away. We read fairy tales, and no one was there to tell us they were problematic. I was reclaiming not only my own life, but my role as her grandmother. Arthur became a constant, steady presence. Our lunches at the diner became a regular tradition. He was my confidant, my advisor, and my dearest friend. One evening, as we sat on my new balcony watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, he reached over and gently took my hand. "Richard would be so proud of you, Helen," he said quietly. "You did exactly what he would have wanted. You protected the family. The real family." His words were the final validation I needed. I realized the promise I'd made had never been about a plot of land or a pile of stones and wood. It was about ensuring the security and well-being of the people who truly mattered. By saving myself and securing Lily's future, I had honored the spirit of my promise in the most profound way possible. I am sitting on that same balcony now. It's morning, and the city below is humming with life. A cup of hot, fragrant tea is warming my hands. A few moments ago, Lily called, her voice bubbling with excitement about the trip to Italy I'm taking her on this summer. We are going to see the art in Florence and eat gelato in Rome. After the call ended, I leaned back in my chair, the warmth of the sun on my face. I had lost a house built of dreams and memories. But in its place, I had found myself. I had traded a gilded cage for a clear sky. The silence in my apartment is no longer the silence of loneliness, but the quiet of sovereignty. It is the peace of a woman who faced down her own ghosts, who stood up to her own flesh and blood, and who had the courage to tear down a broken legacy in order to build a new, stronger one. And for that, I am not resentful. I am, finally, and truly, grateful.